If you ever see this milky white sap dripping from a plant in your backyard, don't cut it down. Not yet. Not until you understand what your great-grandparents already knew. Because that strange, bitter liquid seeping from the stem, it has a name. It has a history. And for nearly 2 centuries, it was one of the most sought-after substances in folk medicine across Europe and America. Today, most people walk right past this plant. They call it a weed. They spray it with chemicals. They rip it from their gardens without a second thought. But rewind just a few generations, and you'd find something very different. You'd find your grandmother's grandmother carefully scoring the stem at dusk, collecting every precious drop. Now, while this video is strictly for educational and historical purposes, we're not doctors here, and we're certainly not telling you to go out and self-medicate. What we are going to do is take you back in time. Back to an era when families relied on the plants growing around them. When knowledge was passed down at kitchen tables, not in waiting rooms. This is wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa, and its story is one of the most fascinating chapters of botanical history that modern society has almost completely forgotten. Let's bring it back. There's a good chance you've seen this plant 100 times and never really looked at it. It grows in disturbed soil, along roadsides, at the edges of fields, in abandoned lots, and yes, probably in your own backyard. Wild lettuce is a member of the Lactuca genus, which might sound familiar. That's because its cousin is sitting in your refrigerator right now. Common garden lettuce, the kind you put in salads, is Lactuca sativa. They're related. But wild lettuce? It's the older, wilder, more potent ancestor that never got domesticated. And here's the first clue that this isn't your average garden weed. It grows tall. We're talking 4 feet, 5 feet, sometimes reaching heights of 7 feet or more under the right conditions. It doesn't sprawl. It doesn't creep along the ground. It stands rigid and upright, like it has somewhere important to be. The stem is thick and solid, with a pale green color that sometimes takes on a slightly purple or reddish hue near the base. Run your fingers along it, and you'll notice it's not soft like most leafy plants. There's a firmness there, a resilience. But the real identification marker? The leaves. Wild lettuce leaves are distinctive. They're oblong, sometimes deeply lobed, with a bluish-green color on top. But flip that leaf over, look at the underside, and here's what separates this plant from its lookalikes. Spines. Small, soft spines running along the central vein, the midrib of the leaf. They're not sharp enough to hurt you, but they're unmistakable once you know what to look for. This is one of the most reliable ways to identify true Lactuca virosa in the wild. The leaves also have a characteristic that gives the whole genus its name. Lactuca comes from the Latin word lac, meaning milk. And if you've ever broken a leaf or scored the stem of this plant, you know exactly why. That thick, white, milky sap that oozes out, that's the signature of the Lactuca family. But in wild lettuce, there's more of it. Much more. And it's different from the watery latex you'd get from your salad lettuce. This sap is thick, sticky, and intensely bitter. The ancient herbalists had a word for this dried sap, lactucarium. When that milky white liquid hits the air, something interesting happens. It begins to oxidize, it darkens, it thickens, and eventually it dries into a brownish, resinous substance that can be scraped off and collected. This lactucarium was the prize. This was what people traveled to gather. This was what apothecaries kept in jars on their shelves. And to understand why, we need to step back into history. Picture this. It's 1850. You're a farmer in rural Pennsylvania. Your back has given out after years of labor. The pain keeps you up at night. You can barely work. There is no pharmacy on the corner. No hospital within a day's ride. No little white pills in a plastic bottle. The doctor, if you can afford one, might come by once a month. And his bag contains precious few remedies. So what do? You do what humans have done for thousands of years. You turn to the plants. Wild lettuce wasn't some fringe folk remedy known only to a few eccentric healers. It was mainstream. It was official. It appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official compendium of medicines, from 1820 until 1926. For over a century, this plant was recognized by the American medical establishment as a legitimate therapeutic substance. In England, and it was listed in the British Pharmaceutical Codex. In France and Germany, it was standard practice among herbalists and physicians alike. The reason? In an era before modern pharmaceuticals, people needed something for pain, something for sleepless nights, something for the cough that wouldn't quit. And wild lettuce provided a gentler alternative that families could grow, gather, and prepare themselves. Now, here's where we need to address something carefully. You may have heard wild lettuce called by another name, poor man's opium. That term gets thrown around a lot today, and it's both illuminating and misleading. Let's unpack it. In the 19th century, the primary means of managing serious pain was opium, derived from the poppy plant. It was effective, yes, but it was also expensive, addictive, and increasingly restricted. And not everyone could afford it or access it, and not everyone wanted to use something that powerful. Wild lettuce emerged as what we might call today an alternative. It was milder, it was accessible. You could grow it in your own garden. And for everyday discomforts, the aches and sleepless nights that didn't require the strongest medicines, it became the go-to for countless families. That's why they called it poor man's opium. Not because it worked the same way, not because it produced the same effects, but because it filled a similar role in the home medicine cabinet when the real thing wasn't available or appropriate. And nowhere was this more evident than during wartime. During the American Civil War, medical supplies were chronically short. Surgeons operated with limited anesthetics. Wounded soldiers faced unimaginable suffering. And when conventional medicines ran out, which happened constantly, Army physicians turned to whatever was available. Historical records show that wild lettuce preparations were among the botanical substitutes used when supplies of conventional sedatives couldn't reach field hospitals. The same was true during periods of shortage in the World Wars. As one 19th century herbalist wrote, "When the pharmacies closed, the garden opened." That line has stuck with me because it captures something essential about how our ancestors thought about plants. They weren't just decorative. They weren't just food. They were the medicine chest. They were the first line of defense. Your great-grandmother probably didn't think of herself as practicing herbal medicine. She was just doing what her mother taught her, what her grandmother taught her. Knowledge that flowed through generations, unbroken, for centuries. And wild lettuce was part of that knowledge, for restless nights when sleep wouldn't come, for the aches that accumulated with age and labor, for the nervous tension that followed difficult times. This plant was there, growing quietly at the edge of the property, ready when needed. Then something changed. The 20th century brought a revolution in medicine: synthetic pharmaceuticals, mass production, standardization. Suddenly, you didn't need to gather plants and prepare remedies yourself. You could walk into a drugstore and buy a uniform pill that worked the same way every time. This was genuine progress. Modern medicine has saved countless lives and relieved immeasurable suffering. We're not here to romanticize the past or pretend that everything was better before. But something was lost, too. The knowledge stopped passing down. Grandmothers who once taught their daughters how to identify healing plants found that their daughters weren't interested. Why learn to make a tea when you can buy a bottle? Why study plants when there's a doctor in town? Within a single generation, centuries of accumulated wisdom began to fade. The plants that had been partners in human health for millennia became, in the modern eye, simply weeds. Wild lettuce was removed from the United States Pharmacopoeia in 1926. Not because new research had proven it worthless, but because the medical establishment was moving towards synthetic, standardized compounds that were easier to regulate and profit from. The plant didn't change. Our relationship to it changed. Today, most people's primary relationship with plants is adversarial. We buy herbicides to kill them. We hire services to remove them. We've become so disconnected from the botanical world that most adults can't identify more than a handful of species growing in their own neighborhoods. And wild lettuce? To modern eyes, it just looks like a tall weed with unruly leaves. something to pull up and throw away. But the plant is still there, still growing, still producing that milky sap that our ancestors valued so highly. It's been waiting quietly for us to remember. If you've ever wondered how your ancestors actually used this plant, how they transformed a wild weed into something useful, this is the part that would have been passed down at kitchen tables. The methods were simple, practical, and honed over generations. Now, remember, we're exploring history here, not giving instructions. What people did generations ago reflected their circumstances, their needs, and their understanding at the time. But understanding these traditional methods helps us appreciate the depth of botanical knowledge that existed in everyday households. The timing traditional gatherers knew that timing mattered. The plant was typically harvested when it was flowering or just about to flower. That's when the lactucarium content was believed to be highest. The preferred time was late afternoon or evening, on when the plant had been soaking up sunshine all day. There was even folk wisdom about the moon phases, though this varied by region and family tradition. What remained consistent was the attention to the plant's life cycle. You didn't just grab any wild lettuce at any time. You watched. You waited. You chose your moment. The sap collection. The most prized substance was the lactucarium itself, that thick, milky sap. To collect it, traditional harvesters would make shallow cuts or scores in the upper stem of the plant, just below the flowering head. The white sap would bead up immediately, looking almost like milk against the green stem. But it didn't stay white for long. Exposed to air, it began to darken, eventually turning brown as it dried. Collectors would return every few hours, sometimes over several days, scraping off the dried resin and making fresh cuts to encourage more flow. The collected lactucarium was then stored in small containers, often glass jars, kept in cool, dark places. This was painstaking work. A single plant might yield only a small amount, but families who relied on this remedy considered it time well spent. The leaf preparations. Not everyone went through the labor of collecting pure lactucarium. A simpler approach, used in many households, involved the leaves themselves. The leaves were gathered, typically the larger ones from lower on the plant, and laid out to dry. This was done in a warm, airy space, out of direct sunlight. A covered porch, an attic room, or a dedicated drying rack might serve the purpose. Once thoroughly dried, the leaves became brittle and could be crumbled by hand. They were then stored in cloth bags or glass containers, ready to be used when needed. The tea. The most common preparation was a simple tea, what the old herbals would call an infusion. A small amount of dried leaf, perhaps a pinch or two depending on the household's tradition, was placed in a cup. Hot water just off the boil was poured over. The cup was covered, often with a saucer, and left to steep. The steeping time varied. Some traditions called for just a few minutes. Others suggested much longer. What everyone agreed on was that the resulting liquid was bitter, intensely, memorably bitter. This was not a pleasant evening beverage. It was medicine, and it tasted like it. Honey was often added. Sometimes the tea was combined with other herbs that families traditionally used, like chamomile or valerian, to round out the flavor and effects. The storage properly dried and stored, wild lettuce preparations could last through the winter and beyond. Families would put up their botanical supplies in autumn, just as they preserved food, ensuring they had what they needed for the cold months when fresh plants weren't available. This was the rhythm of life before modern convenience. You planned ahead. You worked with the seasons. You knew your plants. Now, some of you might be wondering, has anyone actually studied this plant with modern scientific methods? Has anyone put the old folk wisdom under a microscope? The answer is yes, though the research is limited compared to mainstream pharmaceuticals. Scientists have identified the primary compounds in lactucarium. The two most discussed are lacticin and lactocopacrine. These are sesquiterpene lactones. That's a category of bitter compounds found in various plants. Laboratory studies, mostly in test tubes and animal models, have explored these compounds. And while we need to be careful not to overstate findings from preliminary research, the scientific literature does acknowledge that these compounds have been the subject of pharmacological interest. What's important to understand is that traditional knowledge and modern science are asking different questions. Your grandmother didn't need a clinical trial to know that a particular tea helped her sleep better. She had generations of accumulated observation. That's a different kind of evidence, not lesser, just different. The modern research hasn't invalidated the traditional uses. If anything, it's beginning to explain why the old remedies might have worked. But science moves slowly, and plants that can't be patented rarely attract large research investments. What we're left with is a fascinating intersection: ancient knowledge that waited centuries for modern tools to catch up. We've covered a lot of ground together: the identification, the history, the traditional preparations, the modern research. But I want to step back now and talk about something larger. Why does this matter? There's something deeply unsettling about losing knowledge. When your grandmother passed away, and her mother before her, and her mother before that, each of them carried information about the natural world that had been refined over centuries. What plants were useful, when to gather them, how to prepare them, what to watch out for. Most of that knowledge is gone now. Not because it was wrong or primitive, but simply because no one thought to write it down. No one thought the next generation would need it. We trusted that modernity would always provide, that the pharmacy would always be open, that the supply chains would never break. Recent years have taught us that maybe that trust was a little premature. Supply chains do break. Pharmacies do run out. Systems we assumed were permanent turn out to be more fragile than we imagined. This isn't about rejecting modern medicine. It's about not putting all our eggs in one basket. It's about maintaining a relationship with the natural world that sustained humanity for thousands of years before the first laboratory was built. Wild lettuce is just one plant, one thread in a vast tapestry of botanical knowledge that's been unraveling for generations. But every thread we recover matters. Every plant we remember is a connection restored. Because here's the thing: that plant in your backyard hasn't changed. It's still producing the same compounds it produced when your great-great-grandmother collected it by lantern light. Nah, the knowledge is what's missing. The relationship is what's broken, and relationships can be repaired. We started this journey with a simple instruction. If you see that milky sap, don't cut the plant down. Not yet. I hope now you understand why. This isn't just a weed. This is a living connection to your ancestors. This is a plant that fed, soothed, and supported your family line through wars, depressions, and countless ordinary nights of ordinary discomfort. For generations, wild lettuce was the first line of defense before modern medicine took over. We've largely forgotten it, but the plant hasn't changed. It's still growing in the same places, still producing the same milky sap, still waiting for someone to remember. I'm not telling you what to do with this knowledge. I'm not a doctor. I'm not prescribing anything. I'm just a person who believes that forgotten history deserves to be remembered, that the wisdom of our ancestors has value, that somewhere between blind acceptance of the past and blind faith in the present, there's a sensible middle ground. Maybe you'll walk outside after watching this and look at your backyard differently. Maybe you'll notice plants you never noticed before. Maybe you'll start asking older relatives what they remember about how things used to be done. Or maybe you'll just carry this knowledge with you, a small seed planted in the back of your mind, ready to grow when the time is right. Either way, the story of wild lettuce is now part of your story too, because some things are too important to forget. Thanks for watching. If this kind of historical education interests you, consider subscribing. We explore forgotten botanical wisdom every week: the plants our ancestors relied on, the knowledge that's been lost, and the stories that deserve to be remembered. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and maybe take another look at what's growing in your backyard.